Welcome to Sleepy Philosopher, where we transform profound wisdom into a calm and relaxing bedtime story. Tonight, we explore one of history's most fascinating paradoxes, the story of a man who conquered the known world, yet couldn't conquer himself. This is a journey that will take us from the prophecy-laden birth of a prince in ancient Macedonia to the banks of distant rivers, where even the mightiest ambitions meet their limits. We'll witness a young student sitting beneath plane trees, absorbing wisdom from Aristotle that would reshape civilizations. We'll stand beside him as he cuts through the legendary Gordian knot, revealing that some problems require us to question their very assumptions. We'll watch as he builds a causeway across the sea itself at Tyre, demonstrating that persistence can transform the impossible into the inevitable. But this isn't just a story of military conquest. It's an exploration of the eternal tension between ambition and contentment, between destiny and choice, between the outer territories we claim and the inner landscapes we must navigate. We'll discover how a man who united Greek and Persian cultures through radical fusion also wrestled with the burden his own legend created. We'll see how his relentless drive to reach the edges of the world became a philosophical inquiry into the nature of human possibility itself. And we'll witness the profound moment when his exhausted soldiers refused to march further, teaching their leader that true greatness sometimes means listening rather than commanding. Through Alexander's journey, we'll explore questions that remain urgently relevant today. How much of our ambition is truly our own versus inherited expectations? Can boundaries between peoples be dissolved through understanding rather than force? What does it mean to lead with vision rather than domination? And perhaps most importantly, how do we measure the weight of a life, by its length or by its luminosity? Before we dive in, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these philosophical explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which historical figures or topics you'd like us to explore next. So let's now begin to trace the making of a legend who would discover that the greatest conquest is not of territory, but of understanding itself. In the quiet halls of ancient Macedonia, where marble columns caught the Mediterranean moonlight, a child was about to be born who would reshape the world forever. It was the year 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon, when Olympius gave birth to a son who would be called Alexander. But this was no ordinary birth, for the court buzzed with omens that many believed foretold a world-changing destiny. Ancient chronicles tell us that on the night of Alexander's birth, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The soothsayers saw in this event a sign that the goddess had abandoned her earthly temple to attend the birth of one who would surpass all earthly powers. Meanwhile, Philip II, Alexander's father, dreamed that he sealed his wife's womb with a seal bearing the image of a lion, a symbol of strength and kingship that would echo throughout his son's legendary campaigns. These omens weren't merely superstitions. They were the ancient world's way of declaring that greatness was being born under the weight of cosmic expectation. Philip II had brought much of Greece under Macedonian influence through military brilliance and diplomatic cunning. Yet he understood that true power comes not just from conquest, but from the stories people tell about that conquest. The prophecies surrounding Alexander's birth weren't accidents of nature. They were carefully cultivated signs that helped legitimize dynastic power in an age when divine favor was the ultimate source of authority. Here we encounter our first profound insight. Identity often forms not from who we truly are, but from who others expect us to become. Young Alexander would grow up hearing these stories of his cosmic significance, carrying the weight of prophecies like armor, protective yet constraining. But what happens to a child raised in the shadow of such enormous expectations? This dynamic resonates deeply with our modern world. where social media amplifies external pressures, where parents project unfulfilled dreams onto their children, and where career expectations can feel as predetermined as ancient prophecies. We all carry our own invisible omens, the expectations of family, society, and culture that shape our sense of purpose before we've even had the chance to discover what we truly want from life. The question that would haunt Alexander throughout his life is both simple and profound. Was he destined for greatness, or was greatness thrust upon him by the expectations of others? As we sit quietly with this thought, we might ask ourselves, which parts of our ambition are truly our own, and which have been inherited like genetic gifts from the expectations of others? Let that question settle gently as we follow the young prince into the next chapter of his formation. In ancient Myesa, nestled in the Macedonian countryside, Philip II made a decision that would shape not just his son's mind, but the future of the known world. In 343 BCE, he summoned Aristotle, fresh from Athens and carrying the accumulated wisdom of Plato's academy, to educate the 13-year-old Alexander. Picture this moment: the young prince sitting beneath the plane trees of the sacred grove where Aristotle had established his school. Here, in this intimate setting, the future conqueror would learn not merely facts about the world, but how to think about power itself. Aristotle brought with him a revolutionary approach to knowledge, transforming abstract philosophy into practical wisdom for a prince who would one day reshape civilization. The philosopher's teaching method was unlike anything Alexander had experienced in the formal Macedonian court. Rather than lecture and memorization, Aristotle employed the peripatetic approach, walking and discussing, examining the natural world as a living laboratory. He taught Alexander to observe, to question, to categorize, and most importantly, to connect discrete knowledge into coherent understanding. When Aristotle spoke of biology, it was not abstract theory, but the foundation for understanding living systems, from the organization of a beehive to the structure of empire. When he taught ethics, it was not mere moralizing, but the practical art of decision-making under pressure. The Stagirite, as he was known, had studied under Plato, but broke from his mentor's idealism to embrace a philosophy grounded in empirical observation and practical application. This reveals a timeless truth, that wisdom is not passive, but shapes action, that knowledge becomes most powerful when it moves from the mind into lived experience. Modern society still grapples with how education influences leadership and responsibility, just as Philip II understood when he invested in his son's philosophical training. Today, we see this same dynamic in our most pressing challenges, from the way scientific literacy shapes climate policy to how technological understanding influences political decision-making, to the critical question of whether our educational systems prepare leaders for genuine service or merely for power itself. The algorithms that shape your social media feed, the economic theories that guide national policy, the psychological insights that inform parenting, all represent knowledge transformed into tools that shape reality. In the quiet spaces between thoughts, notice how your own education, both formal and informal, continues to shape your decisions today. The skills you learned, the questions you were taught to ask, the patterns of thinking that were reinforced, all of these remain active forces in how you perceive and respond to the world around you. In this recognition, we glimpse the eternal truth Aristotle revealed to his royal student, that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the careful cultivation of a mind capable of seeing clearly and acting wisely. The education Aristotle provided would be tested sooner than anyone expected. In 340 BCE, while still only 16 years old and barely finished with his formal studies, Alexander faced his first real crisis of leadership. Philip II had left his teenage son as regent while he campaigned elsewhere. and the Thracian Madi tribe chose this moment to test whether a boy could command respect in a world that respected only proven strength. The Thracian lands were wild and unpredictable, a landscape where political tensions could erupt into violence without warning. Yet observe how young Alexander moved, not with the reckless impulsiveness of youth seeking to prove himself, but with a calculated clarity that spoke to something deeper than mere courage. Alexander gathered his forces, marched against the Madi, defeated them decisively, and established a settlement called Alexandropolis, his first city, a statement that this was no temporary victory, but a lasting assertion of authority. What we witness here is the birth of a fundamental principle that would define his approach to every challenge he would face. True leadership is not the absence of fear, but the presence of clarity in the midst of fear. His genius lay not in some supernatural bravery, but in his ability to maintain mental precision when others would have been overwhelmed by the chaos of rebellion. He had learned from Aristotle to see situations with philosophical detachment, even while acting with decisive force. This ancient wisdom speaks to every leader facing sudden challenges today, whether in corporate boardrooms where market forces seem to rebel against carefully laid plans, or in personal relationships where unexpected crises demand immediate response. The lesson endures. In those crucial moments when everything seems to hang in the balance, the greatest strength comes not from rushing into action, but from cultivating the clarity that transforms pressure into purpose. Yet even as Alexander proved himself on the battlefield, he lived in the profound psychological shadow of his father's towering achievements. Imagine a young man standing at the base of a mountain he can never quite climb over. This was Alexander's daily reality. Every achievement measured against Philip's conquests, every victory weighed against his father's revolutionary reforms of the Macedonian army, every moment of potential greatness filtered through the lens of what had already been accomplished by the man who had transformed a peripheral kingdom into the dominant power of the Greek world. In the royal courts of Pella, young Alexander would have witnessed the reverence bestowed upon his father, how generals spoke of Philip's tactical genius, how diplomats acknowledged his diplomatic brilliance, how even the gods seemed to favor the man who had brought the Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership through the League of Corinth. Yet in the quiet moments, perhaps during late-night conversations with his companions, or in the privacy of his chambers, Alexander wrestled with questions that have haunted every generation. Who am I beyond what my father has made possible? What does my own worth consist of, apart from his legacy? These weren't merely personal struggles, but philosophical tensions that would shape the very foundations of his character. This raises a profound insight, that personal greatness must emerge from internal rather than external comparison. Consider how different Alexander's path might have been had he simply sought to outdo Philip's territorial conquests, rather than forging his own vision of what conquest could mean. The young prince began to understand that true greatness wasn't measured in the lands you could add to an empire, but in the depths you could plumb within yourself. He learned to ask not, "How does my victory compare to my father's?" but rather, "What does this victory reveal about my own understanding of honor, courage, and the human condition?" This subtle shift from external validation to internal discovery would become the cornerstone of his philosophical approach to life. Modern individuals struggle with similar comparison pressures amplified by social media, scrolling through highlight reels of others' achievements, feeling our own accomplishments somehow diminished by the perpetual showcase of success around us. Yet Alexander's ancient wisdom whispers to us across the millennia, cultivate personal metrics of success. Define greatness not by what others have accomplished, but by your own understanding of meaning, purpose, and growth. This lesson would sustain him through what came next, a moment that would test whether he could finally step out from his father's shadow and into his own light. In 336 BCE, that moment arrived with shocking brutality. Picture a wedding celebration at Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedon, where Philip II was marrying his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander III of Epirus. The air should have been filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of wine cups, celebrating a union that would strengthen political alliances. Instead, it became the stage for one of history's most shocking betrayals. As the guests watched in horror, Pausanias of Orestis, a member of Philip's own personal bodyguard, stepped forward from the shadows and drove his blade into the king's chest. In that instant, 20-year-old Alexander, who had been tutored by Aristotle in the ideals of reason and virtue, witnessed the brutal reality that even the mightiest rulers walk on treacherous ground. The assassin's motive remains debated. Was it personal revenge for a grievance against Philip, political conspiracy involving Persian gold, or the unpredictable fury of a spurned courtier? Perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that in one swift moment, the established order crumbled, and the crown passed to a young man who faced immediate threats from all sides. Alexander's position was far from secure. Rival claimants existed. Greek city-states saw an opportunity to revolt, and neighboring kingdoms sensed weakness. This reveals a truth that would echo through all of Alexander's campaigns, that control is always partial, no matter one's status. Philip II had transformed Macedon from a relatively minor kingdom into the dominant power of Greece. Yet for all his strategic brilliance, for all his political acumen, he could not see the threat that walked beside him every day. His own bodyguard, a man entrusted with his very life, became his destroyer. This paradox of power, that the very structures designed to protect can become instruments of destruction, speaks to a profound truth about human authority. We build our institutions, our hierarchies, our safeguards, believing they insulate us from chaos. But the assassin's blade reminds us that certainty is always an illusion, however necessary and beneficial our systems may be. Contemporary life mirrors this instability through unexpected disruptions. The pandemic that brought even the most robust healthcare systems to their knees. The technological disruption that made entire industries obsolete overnight. The trusted advisor who becomes the source of a devastating scandal. These events share the same essential quality as Philip's assassination. They expose the fragility beneath our carefully constructed certainties. Yet Alexander's response to his father's murder offers us a profound lesson in adaptive leadership. Rather than being paralyzed by shock or consumed by revenge, he moved with remarkable swiftness and intelligence. Within months, he had secured his position by eliminating rival claimants, dealt with the immediate threats, and begun the delicate work of maintaining loyalty among the Macedonian nobles who might have challenged his right to rule. When Thebes revolted, testing the young king's resolve, he responded decisively, not with the rash anger of youth, but with calculated force that demonstrated his authority. This wasn't the impulsive reaction of grief, but rather the cultivation of what philosophers call practical wisdom, the ability to respond effectively to circumstances as they unfold. In our modern lives, this translates to developing what psychologists call psychological flexibility, the capacity to adapt our thinking and behavior when faced with unexpected challenges. Like Alexander stepping into sudden kingship, we too can learn to transform disruptions into moments of authentic growth, discovering capabilities we never knew we possessed. For in those moments of greatest uncertainty, we often find our truest selves. With his position in Macedonia secure, Alexander turned his attention to the grand vision his father had been planning, the invasion of Persia. But he would approach this conquest with a philosophy entirely his own. one that would challenge everything the ancient world believed about empire and identity. As his armies swept through Asia Minor in 334 BCE, defeating Persian forces and liberating Greek cities, Alexander began to reveal something revolutionary about his intentions. Where traditional conquerors sought to dominate and extract, Alexander seemed to be searching for something deeper, a way to weave together the disparate threads of human civilization into a tapestry neither purely Greek nor purely Eastern, but something unprecedented. In 333 BCE at Gordian, Alexander encountered a challenge that would become legendary, and that perfectly illustrated his approach to seemingly impossible problems. In the temple of Zeus stood an ancient cart, its yoke bound with an impossibly complex knot made of cornel bark. The local prophecy declared that whoever could untie this knot would rule all of Asia. For generations, countless hands had wrestled with those twisted strands, each failing to find the traditional solution. But as witnesses gathered to watch the young conqueror attempt what so many before him could not achieve, Alexander revealed something profound about the nature of problems themselves. According to tradition, rather than spending hours tracing each strand and working within the established framework, Alexander simply drew his sword and cut through the knot with one swift motion. In that decisive act, he demonstrated a truth that resonates across millennia. Sometimes our greatest limitations are not the problems themselves, but our unquestioned assumptions about how those problems must be solved. The knot had become a symbol of how civilizations bind themselves to familiar patterns, even when those patterns no longer serve their highest purposes. By reframing the challenge from "how do we untie this knot" to "how do we achieve the knot's intended outcome," ruling Asia, Alexander showed that true innovation often requires us to question the very premises that seem self-evident. The prophecy spoke of ruling Asia, not specifically of untying leather. In that distinction lies a profound truth about creative thinking. This wisdom speaks directly to our modern age of seemingly intractable problems. We face climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, challenges that feel as tangled as that ancient knot. And like the generations before Alexander, we often approach them with inherited methodologies, expecting to solve 21st century dilemmas with 19th century thinking. Alexander's lesson is not about crude force or dismissive innovation, but about the courage to ask, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is not working harder within the system, but pausing to question whether the system itself serves our highest intentions. In your own life, what assumptions might you be honoring that no longer serve your deepest goals? What knots are you trying to untie that might simply need to be cut through with a different understanding of the problem itself? By 332 BCE, Alexander's campaign brought him to one of his most formidable challenges yet, the island fortress of Tyre on the Lebanese coast. Picture this moment. There stands Alexander, gazing across a narrow but seemingly insurmountable stretch of water at a city that rose from the sea like a jeweled crown, its walls protected by both geography and human ingenuity. Tyre had withstood sieges from the greatest empires of the ancient world. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, all had failed to conquer this maritime stronghold. For 7 months, this city would resist Alexander's advance, testing not just his military capabilities, but his fundamental understanding of what makes something truly impossible. What Alexander did next would become one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of how persistence can literally reshape the landscape of possibility. His engineers began building a causeway from the mainland to the island, stone by stone, log by log, extending this artificial land bridge across the waters that separated them from their goal. Day after day, while defenders rained down projectiles and arrows from above, while Tyrian ships attempted to disrupt the construction, his men worked with unwavering focus. The obstacle of water that seemed permanent, absolute, unchangeable, became nothing more than an intermediate configuration awaiting transformation. This achievement reveals a profound truth. The greatest barriers in life are rarely permanent absolutes. They are temporary configurations, awaiting transformation through sustained intention and creative problem-solving. Just as Alexander didn't simply wait for the tide to change or the walls to crumble, we need not wait for circumstances to shift in our favor. Sometimes, the path itself must be built. Sometimes, the solution requires us to become architects of possibility, extending bridges across waters that others see as unbridgeable. The fortress of Tyre eventually fell, not because Alexander conquered it, but because he had already conquered the concept of limitation itself. This ancient lesson speaks to every goal that feels unreachable in your own experience, that career advancement that seems blocked, that creative project that lacks resources, that relationship that appears beyond repair. We tend to see these obstacles as immutable facts of reality, but Alexander's causeway reminds us that persistence can transform the impossible into the inevitable. Following his triumph at Tyre, Alexander continued south into Egypt, where in 331 BCE he would experience a moment that would profoundly affect his understanding of his own identity and purpose. In the vast silence of the Egyptian desert, where ancient sands have witnessed the whispers of countless civilizations, Alexander made a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Siwa, one of the most revered religious sites of the ancient world. The priestess, eyes glazed with divine inspiration, spoke words that would echo through history. "You are the son of Zeus Ammon." In that moment, Alexander faced one of humanity's most profound questions, not about military strategy or political power, but about the deeper mystery of what it means when the universe seems to declare your purpose. The oracle's declaration posed a fundamental challenge to Alexander's understanding of himself. If he was truly divine, what role did his choices play in shaping his destiny? This wasn't merely a theological question, it was an existential crisis that strikes at the heart of human agency. The ancient Greeks, masters of philosophical inquiry, grappled with this very paradox. The Delphic oracle had proclaimed, "Know thyself." Yet here was a proclamation that seemed to define him before he could truly know himself. This tension between destiny and free will would become a defining philosophical struggle, not just for Alexander, but for every person who has ever questioned whether their path through life is written in the stars or carved by their own hand. Today, we see this same philosophical tension playing out in our contemporary world. The rise of genetic testing promises to reveal our predispositions, while algorithms seem to predict our choices before we make them. We speak of finding our purpose, while simultaneously believing we can create our own destiny. Modern psychology recognizes this as the fundamental tension between determinism and agency, the question of whether we are products of our circumstances or the authors of our experience. Alexander's internal struggle at Siwa mirrors our own daily negotiations with this paradox. When we face major life decisions, career changes, relationships, creative pursuits, we often experience that same moment of uncertainty. Are we following our authentic selves, or are we responding to pressures we barely recognize? Perhaps Alexander's true wisdom lies not in resolving this paradox, but in how he chose to hold both truths simultaneously. Rather than being paralyzed by the weight of cosmic expectation, he seemed to embrace both aspects of his identity, the divine destiny and the human agency required to fulfill it. This offers us a profound insight. The tension between destiny and agency need not be a source of anxiety, but rather a creative tension that gives life meaning. Like Alexander in that desert temple, we can hold both truths, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, while still possessing the power to shape our response to that calling. With this understanding settling into his consciousness, Alexander emerged from Siwa with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the heart of the Persian Empire itself. The decisive confrontation came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Alexander faced Darius III and the full might of the Persian Empire on a battlefield of the Persian king's choosing. But what happened after this victory reveals far more about Alexander's vision than the battle itself. When Alexander entered Babylon, the ancient seat of Persian power, he made a decision that defied the very logic of empire as the ancient world understood it. Rather than imposing rigid hierarchies and Greek supremacy, rather than dismantling the sophisticated systems that had governed this vast territory, Alexander chose a radically different path. He chose fusion over domination, synthesis over subjugation. In that magnificent city, Alexander donned Persian robes, adopted Persian customs, and embraced practices that many of his fellow Macedonians found deeply offensive. But what seemed like political theater was actually something far more radical, a genuine philosophical commitment to the dissolution of artificial boundaries between peoples. This wasn't mere adaptation, it was a systematic dismantling of the very concept of cultural superiority. Alexander's policy of cultural fusion manifested in profound ways. He incorporated Persian administrative systems and governors into his governance, recognizing the sophisticated bureaucracy that had held together this vast multicultural empire for over 2 centuries. He retained Persian satraps, the regional governors who had served Darius III, valuing their expertise in governing diverse peoples. Local customs, religious practices, and administrative traditions were not erased but respected, creating what we might recognize today as a genuinely multicultural approach to governance. Most dramatically, in 324 BCE at Susa, Alexander orchestrated a mass wedding ceremony where he himself married Statera, daughter of Darius III, while 90 of his companions married Persian noblewomen in a single celebration. This wasn't merely diplomatic, it was philosophical, embodying his belief that the future lay not in the dominance of one culture over another, but in their creative fusion. The Macedonian veterans, with their warrior traditions and rough simplicity, looked upon these ceremonies with deep suspicion and resentment. These were men who had conquered through strength, who understood loyalty in terms of blood and brotherhood forged in battle. Now they were being asked to welcome the very people they had defeated into their most intimate family bonds. Meanwhile, the Persian nobility faced their own crisis of identity. Centuries of imperial tradition, of seeing themselves as the center of civilization, now required them to accept these northern conquerors not as rulers to serve, but as equals, as sons and fathers, husbands and brothers. This was no mere political arrangement, this was cultural transformation at its most personal, most vulnerable level. What emerges from this grand experiment is a profound insight. Unity demands both sacrifice and imagination, but the nature of that sacrifice differs dramatically between peoples. The Macedonians were asked to surrender their assumption of superiority, to see themselves not as conquerors lording over subjects, but as equal partners in a new kind of empire. This required them to imagine a different kind of victory, one that didn't rely on the clear boundaries of us versus them. The Persians, in turn, had to sacrifice their inherited sense of cultural centrality, to envision themselves not as the natural rulers of the world, but as co-creators of something entirely unprecedented. Both groups were being asked to let go of identities that had been forged over generations, to step into a liminal space where the familiar rules no longer applied. This is the courage that true cultural integration demands. the willingness to become partially unknown to yourself while trusting in the possibility of becoming something more complete. Cultures are not simply collections of customs or beliefs, but living networks of meaning, of belonging, of understanding who we are in relation to others. When Alexander brought these two worlds together through marriage, he was essentially asking people to reweave the very fabric of their identity. Some individuals embraced this opportunity to expand their understanding of what was possible. Others resisted, feeling that to integrate meant to lose something essential about themselves. This ancient experiment speaks directly to our contemporary moment. We live in an age of unprecedented connectivity, yet we witness the resurgence of nationalism, tribal thinking, and the dangerous fiction of cultural purity. Just as Alexander saw through the illusion of permanent separation between Greeks and Persians, we might recognize how our modern divisions, whether ethnic, religious, or ideological, are often constructed rather than inevitable. In our interconnected world, where global teams must navigate cultural differences daily, where social media can either amplify our divisions or reveal our common humanity, Alexander's vision suggests that identity itself might be more fluid than we assume. What if our deepest cultural identities are not fixed essences, but dynamic possibilities? What if the boundaries we defend so passionately are actually the very barriers preventing us from realizing our full potential as human beings? The answer, perhaps, lies in approaching unfamiliar cultures with curiosity rather than fear. Curiosity asks, what can I learn from this? What beauty might I discover? What might I become if I allow myself to be influenced by something different? Fear asks, what might I lose? What threatens my sense of self? Alexander's experiment teaches us that the first question leads to expansion, while the second leads to contraction. His vision of a unified empire was never really about political control. It was about the audacious belief that humans, beneath all their surface differences, share a fundamental desire for belonging that transcends the boundaries we construct to keep others out. The Hellenistic period that followed his death would birth unprecedented cultural flowering, precisely because Alexander had broken down the barriers that had previously confined human possibility within narrow tribal boundaries. Yet even as Alexander pursued this grand vision of cultural synthesis, his relentless drive to push beyond every known boundary revealed another dimension of his philosophy, one that speaks to the very nature of human ambition itself. By 326 BCE, the Macedonian army had ventured into the Indian subcontinent, beyond the known edges of the Greek world, beyond the territories of the fallen Persian Empire, into lands that existed only as myth and rumor to most Mediterranean minds. What drove this endless march? Was it merely hunger for territory, or was Alexander pursuing something that transcended material conquest entirely? Consider this deeper dimension. What Alexander sought was not the mere accumulation of kingdoms, but the expansion of his own consciousness into territories previously unimagined. Each conquered city, each crossed mountain range, each new culture encountered was not simply a tactical victory, but a psychological frontier crossed. When he founded Alexandria in Egypt in 331 BCE, or when he established dozens of cities bearing his name across Asia, he was not merely stamping his authority, he was literally mapping the contours of human possibility onto the landscape itself. The ancient Greeks had a word for the longing that drove Alexander forward: Pothos. It speaks of passionate yearning for something absent, something perpetually out of reach. Plato himself distinguished Pothos from ordinary desire, explaining that while common wanting seeks what is present and attainable, Pothos reaches toward that which remains forever beyond one's grasp. Alexander was consumed by this divine restlessness. this sacred discontent that could never be satisfied by any conquered city or subjugated king. Each horizon he crossed revealed only another horizon beyond. Each mystery he solved unveiled deeper mysteries still. In this way, his physical journey across the earth became a mirror for the internal journey of consciousness, always reaching, always growing, always discovering that true understanding recedes like the ocean's edge as we approach it. This suggests that true ambition operates on a level beyond the material, seeking not to possess the world, but to discover what the world contains when viewed through the lens of unlimited possibility. His was an ambition that sought to transcend the constraints not just of geography, but of imagination itself. In our contemporary moment, we witness this same phenomenon. The entrepreneur who builds not merely a company, but a vision of how commerce might transform human connection. The artist who doesn't create mere paintings, but reimagines what visual language itself might become. The scientist who pushes against the boundaries of what we consider knowable about our universe. We see this in our digital age, where the most ambitious individuals aren't simply seeking personal success, but are driven by a vision of how technology might expand human consciousness itself. Yet here's the crucial question Alexander's example poses for us. Are our ambitions truly transcendent, or do they simply seek new forms of the same material accumulation? Are we expanding our sense of what's possible, or are we simply seeking new territories to dominate? The paradox of Alexander's ambition, indeed, the paradox of all genuine ambition, is that in seeking to transcend the limits of the possible, we may discover that the deepest expansion occurs not outward, but inward. His endless campaigns were simultaneously the most expansive and the most isolating of human endeavors. In reaching for the edges of the known world, he touched something universal in the human experience, that drive to push beyond our given circumstances, to discover whether we are larger than the containers life provides for us. The meaning of ambition, then, lies not in its external victories, but in its capacity to reveal to us who we might become when we refuse to accept the limits others set for us. This philosophy of endless striving was tested in the grueling march through the Gordian desert in 325 BCE, where Alexander's army faced perhaps its greatest trial. Temperatures soared and water became more precious than gold. Here was a moment where traditional ideas of comfort and security were stripped away entirely. Alexander's march through this wasteland wasn't merely strategic, it was philosophical. In the face of seemingly impossible conditions, endurance itself becomes a teacher, stripping away the superficial layers of our existence to reveal what truly matters. The desert demanded not just physical strength, but mental clarity, forcing both leader and follower to confront the fundamental question of why they were there at all. This challenges our modern understanding of what it means to settle or find our place in the world. Today, we often seek stability as the highest good, the secure job, the predictable routine, the comfortable relationships. But Alexander's march suggests that sometimes the deepest insights come not from finding our place, but from moving beyond it. Each difficult journey becomes a mirror reflecting our true nature back to us. The exhaustion reveals our limits, the challenges expose our fears, and the perseverance shows us what we're truly capable of becoming. It's in these moments of physical and mental strain that we often discover our most authentic selves. When we embrace demanding journeys rather than avoiding them, we find that endurance becomes our teacher, showing us that our limitations are often far more flexible than we imagined, and that purpose emerges not from comfort, but from the courage to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. Yet there are limits that even the greatest will cannot overcome, limits not imposed by geography or enemy armies, but by the very people who follow us. we find ourselves now at a moment of profound human tension. Standing on the banks of the Hyphasis River in 326 BCE, where Alexander faced perhaps his greatest leadership challenge. The monsoon-swollen waters stretched before him, beyond which lay the fertile plains of the Ganges, territories waiting to be claimed. Yet behind him stood his soldiers, not the eager warriors who had left Macedonia 8 years earlier, but weary men who had followed him across deserts and mountains, through battles and sieges, carrying wounds both seen and hidden. When they quietly refused to march further east, Alexander discovered something profound about the nature of leadership itself. In that charged moment of confrontation, we witness a leader faced with the fundamental tension that every person in authority must navigate: the pull between personal vision and collective well-being. Alexander could have demanded obedience through the sheer force of his will and authority. He could have reminded them of his divine heritage, his unquestioned military genius, the vast empire that depended on his next conquest. Instead, something deeper emerged, a recognition that true leadership cannot exist without trust, and trust cannot exist without understanding the hearts of those who follow. According to ancient sources, Alexander's general Conus approached his king and spoke of the soldiers' laments, their longing for home, their fear of what lay ahead. The army's refusal to advance was not cowardice. It was the manifestation of an internal limit, a psychological boundary that had been stretched beyond its capacity. Here lies one of the most profound paradoxes of leadership, that strength is not diminished by vulnerability, but rather enhanced by it. Alexander's decision to listen, to acknowledge his men's exhaustion, to share in their concerns rather than dismiss them, this was not weakness but a form of courage that requires more than battlefield prowess. He initially retreated to his tent in disappointment, wrestling with this first true defeat, not by an enemy army, but by the limitations of human endurance. Ultimately, he erected 12 massive altars on the banks of the Hyphasis to mark the furthest extent of his campaign, then turned his army back. It requires the humility to see yourself not as separate from those you lead, but as part of a shared human journey. The greatest leaders understand that authority without empathy becomes mere domination, and domination without genuine care for followers ultimately destroys itself. This ancient moment speaks directly to every modern challenge we face in guiding others. The parent who must set boundaries while honoring their child's emotional needs, the manager who must drive results while maintaining team morale, the teacher who must challenge students while supporting their growth. Each faces the same fundamental question Alexander confronted: how do we honor both our vision for what could be and our responsibility for who we are leading? The answer lies not in choosing between firmness and compassion, but in discovering how they can strengthen each other. True leadership asks us to be both unwavering in our values and gentle in our approach, both clear in our direction and patient with the pace of those who follow. Alexander's response to the mutiny at Hyphasis demonstrates a leadership principle that modern research has only recently articulated: that the most effective leaders create psychological ownership among their followers, inspiring devotion through vision rather than commanding obedience through force. This brings us to a recognition that Alexander anticipated modern leadership principles long before they were formally named. While management theorists like James McGregor Burns and Bernard Bass were developing concepts of transformational leadership in the late 20th century, Alexander was already demonstrating them on battlefields from Macedonia to India nearly 23 centuries earlier. But what made his approach so revolutionary then and so relevant now? The answer lies not in his tactical brilliance, but in his ability to create meaning. Alexander didn't merely command armies. He cultivated communities bound by shared purpose. when he told his soldiers they were participating in something unprecedented, when he blended cultures and customs, when he promised them not just conquest, but transformation. He was practicing what modern psychology calls purpose-driven leadership. The contrast is striking when we examine how Alexander inspired devotion versus how traditional rulers maintained control. Where others relied on fear, hierarchy, and rigid authority, Alexander created what researchers today call psychological ownership among his followers. They didn't just follow him, they believed in him. They didn't just obey orders, they internalized his vision as their own. This wasn't mere charisma, it was sophisticated leadership psychology. Alexander understood that people don't just want tasks to complete, they want significance to experience. When your followers believe they're participating in something greater than themselves, when they see their individual roles as essential to a grand narrative, when they feel personally invested in the outcome, then you've transcended mere management and achieved true leadership transformation. Today's innovators, from tech entrepreneurs to social justice leaders to educational reformers, face the same fundamental challenge Alexander confronted. How do you inspire people to give their best when the rewards aren't immediate or guaranteed? The answer remains remarkably consistent across millennia. Communicate purpose clearly. Show people how their individual contributions connect to something larger. Create environments where people feel valued, not just for what they produce, but for who they are. Build bridges between different cultures and perspectives. And above all, help others see themselves not as followers of your vision, but as co-creators of something unprecedented. In your own life, consider this. Whether you're leading a team project, organizing a community initiative, or simply inspiring family members toward a shared goal, you have the opportunity to practice transformational leadership. The ancient Macedonian king didn't leave behind technological innovations or political institutions that survived him intact. But he did leave behind something far more enduring. A model for inspiring human beings to become more than they thought possible, simply by believing in something larger than themselves. Yet for all his achievements, for all his visionary leadership and cultural synthesis, Alexander could not escape the fundamental reality that haunts every human life, no matter how extraordinary. The burden of his accumulated glory became its own kind of prison. In the quiet aftermath of each victory, when the cheers had faded and the celebrations had ended, Alexander found himself alone with a weight that no battlefield had prepared him for. The very legend he had carefully cultivated, Alexander the Great, the Invincible, the Conqueror, had become a prison of expectations from which there would be no escape. For every victory simply raised the bar of what people expected from him next. The mathematical precision of this burden is almost cruel. Each triumph doubled the weight of the next expectation. He had created, through his own extraordinary achievements, a psychological trap where past success became the enemy of future peace. This phenomenon reveals something fundamental about the human condition. Public success creates what social scientists call impression management pressures. The exhausting work of maintaining the persona that others expect us to embody. Think of the entrepreneur whose first success leads to investors demanding exponential growth. The artist whose breakthrough work becomes a millstone around their neck. The athlete whose championship season transforms into the unbearable weight of defending their title. The irony is devastating. We reach for glory thinking it will free us, only to discover that it has bound us to a cycle of perpetual performance that can never truly satisfy our original aspirations for peace and fulfillment. Alexander's later years reveal how fame can isolate us from authentic human connection. When you become a legend, people struggle to relate to you as a fellow human being with vulnerabilities and doubts. They see only the armor of your public persona, never the person beneath. This creates a profound loneliness that haunts many public figures, surrounded by admirers but starved of genuine intimacy. And then came the ultimate equalizer, the one force that respects neither legend nor achievement. As Alexander's fever intensified in the Babylonian heat of June 323 BCE, his once invincible army watched with a mixture of fear and realization that their conqueror, like all mortals, was subject to the same fundamental limits. He was only 32 years old. The exact cause of his death remains debated, whether typhoid fever, malaria, or poisoning. But what's certain is that in those final days, as Alexander lay unable to speak, ancient sources tell us that his soldiers filed past his bed, one by one, to see their leader one last time. This moment of confrontation with mortality offers us a profound philosophical insight, that human fragility is the great democratic force in existence. Consider how this revelation would have struck his companions, men who had seen Alexander's armies reshape the known world, who had witnessed his strategic brilliance turn impossible odds into victories. Yet here, in the soft glow of Babylonian lamplight, they confronted the truth that all human achievement, no matter how extraordinary, unfolds within the delicate vessel of mortal flesh. The young king, who had conquered the known world from Greece to the borders of India, found himself, in his final days, confined to a single room, tended by a few loyal companions. The vast empire he had built stretched beyond the horizon, yet, in those quiet moments before his death, only the present moment remained. When asked to whom he would leave his kingdom, Alexander's response was cryptic: to the strongest. In these final moments, we glimpse a different understanding of greatness, not the relentless march across continents, but perhaps a recognition that meaning emerges from intention rather than duration. Alexander lived with extraordinary intensity for 32 years, and his brief life created ripples that shaped civilizations for centuries to come. This challenges our modern obsession with longevity over purpose. We measure success by years of service, by accumulated wealth, by the simple fact of having endured. But Alexander's story whispers that a life touched by deliberate intention can burn as brightly in 32 years as in 90. Modern life often feels like a race toward accumulation. More years, more accomplishments, more security. Yet Alexander's brief flame suggests that the weight of a life is measured not in its length, but in its luminosity. Each of us faces this choice daily. Will we spend our energy pursuing the safety of endless tomorrows? Or will we risk the vulnerability of pursuing what truly matters today? The ancient king teaches us that alignment, not achievement, creates lasting meaning. Whether we have 32 years or 90, whether our achievements span continents or touch only the people in our immediate circle, what matters is that we act from a place of authentic intention. In our contemporary world, we have built elaborate systems that seem to shield us from this fundamental truth. We live in an age of medical miracles, technological advancement, and social structures that promise security and longevity. Yet beneath these protections, the ancient reality remains unchanged. Our contemporary obsession with productivity, achievement, and the accumulation of experiences often serves as a sophisticated form of denial about our mortality. We race through life collecting accomplishments like Alexander collected victories, sometimes forgetting that the profound beauty of existence lies not in what we accumulate, but in our capacity to remain present to the precious, fragile gift of each moment. Alexander's confrontation with mortality teaches us that true wisdom emerges not from avoiding this reality, but from allowing it to deepen our appreciation for the present moment. When we remember that our time is finite, every ordinary day becomes extraordinary. Every shared conversation, every quiet breath, Every simple pleasure takes on the weight of miracle that it truly is. In this way, mortality becomes not our enemy, but our most profound teacher, guiding us toward a life of deeper gratitude and authentic presence. The conqueror who sought the ends of the earth ultimately discovered that the most profound conquest is learning to live fully within the boundaries of our mortal time. In this recognition, we find a peace that no empire could ever provide. As our long journey through Alexander's story draws to its gentle close, let us ask ourselves, what is the true legacy of this extraordinary life? The empires crumble, the maps redraw themselves. The cities he founded have been rebuilt countless times, but something remains, something more enduring than stone or territory. Perhaps Alexander's greatest gift to us is not the maps of his empire, but the compass of his questions. What if the true legacy of Alexander is not empire, but the questions he leaves us? Alexander understood something that perhaps we are only beginning to rediscover in our modern world, that the greatest conquest is not of land or people, but of the boundaries we place around human possibility itself. Throughout our journey tonight, we have traced his footsteps across continents, watched empires rise beneath his hand, witnessed the transformation of the ancient world. But what if his relentless forward motion signified something beyond territorial hunger? What if, as his education under Aristotle suggests, Alexander's true journey was one of expanding consciousness rather than merely expanding territory? From the age of 13 until 16, Alexander studied under Aristotle in the gardens of Mieza. The philosopher planted seeds of curiosity that would bloom into an insatiable appetite for knowledge. When Alexander later marched through Persia and beyond, he brought with him scientists, historians, and philosophers to document everything they encountered. This was not the behavior of a simple conqueror. This was the journey of a mind that understood expansion as a form of learning. Each horizon crossed revealed not just new lands, but new ways of understanding what it means to be human. Each culture encountered offered not just subjects to rule, but teachers offering different perspectives on life's fundamental questions. In our modern world, we are often driven by accumulation, more possessions, more achievements, more recognition. We measure success by what we can hold in our hands rather than what we can hold in our understanding. Yet Alexander's story whispers to us across the centuries that the truest expansion occurs within the landscape of the mind. When you learn a new perspective, when you genuinely understand someone different from yourself, when you question a belief you have held since childhood, these are the conquests that matter. The territory of your consciousness grows larger, more hospitable to truth, more capable of wisdom. You need not travel to distant lands to experience this kind of expansion. The journey inward requires only the courage to explore what you do not yet know about yourself and your world. So let this gentle truth settle into your awareness as you rest. True exploration is internal as much as external. The maps we draw of distant places pale beside the maps we might draw of our own hearts and minds, those unmeasured territories where our deepest growth occurs. Alexander reached the edges of the known world, yet even he understood that some horizons can never be crossed by marching armies. They can only be approached through contemplation, through wonder, through the patient expansion of understanding itself. In our contemporary world, we see nations grappling with the same tensions Alexander faced. The desire for unity against the reality of diversity, the hunger for progress balanced against the wisdom of restraint, the personal ambition that drives achievement while threatening to isolate us from our shared humanity. The multinational corporations that span continents, the global movements that connect activists across oceans, the digital networks that make the world's knowledge instantly accessible, all these bear the DNA of Alexander's vision of a connected world. even as they grapple with the same challenges he encountered, how to maintain human dignity while pursuing vast ambitions. Today, when you face the choice between personal advancement and collective good, you encounter the same crossroads that defined Alexander's journey. When nations struggle to balance sovereignty with international cooperation, they wrestle with the same vision of unity and diversity that Alexander pursued. When individuals question how much is enough, whether in wealth, achievement, or recognition, they face the fundamental inquiry that haunted Alexander even in his final days. What is the true measure of a life well lived? He shows us that greatness lies not in arriving at final answers, but in expanding the horizon of possibility for those who follow. Your own search for meaning, your own daily choices between courage and comfort, your own moments of wondering what truly matters. These are the inheritors of Alexander's deepest insights. The empire may have crumbled, but the questions remain eternally alive, carried forward by each person who dares to ask what it means to push beyond the boundaries of the possible. And in that eternal questioning, perhaps we find the most enduring conquest of all, not the conquest of lands or peoples, but the conquest of our own limited vision of what we might become. Tonight, as sleep begins to soften the edges of your thoughts, consider what new territory you might explore within yourself tomorrow, not by grasping, not by conquering, but simply by opening your mind a little wider to receive what life wishes to teach you. In this way, every moment becomes an opportunity for the most meaningful kind of growth, the growth that no empire can contain. Thank you for joining me on this philosophical journey through the life of Alexander the Great. As you drift into sleep tonight, may you carry with you the wisdom that true conquest begins within, that boundaries are often illusions waiting to be questioned, and that a life of meaning comes not from the territories we claim, but from the courage to keep asking what it means to be fully, authentically human. Sleep well, dream gently, and may you awaken tomorrow ready to explore the unmapped territories of your own extraordinary potential. Good night.